her ex-husband, her car fall off the bridge, the Mafia boss grabbed her hand, and then… I sat quietly in the car just outside the Riverside High School gate for more than 10 minutes, staring at the stack of ungraded tests piled on the passenger seat. At 39 years old, an English teacher and a single mother, I still found red ink stains clinging to my fingertips every Tuesday night. The engine faded into a soft ticking sound that echoed like my own heart, worn down and pushing through its final beats after a long, exhausting day. "Claire, he is back," Melissa's voice echoed in my mind. A call from about 20 minutes earlier, spoken with a blend of warning and pleading. "You need to call the police again. Todd has shown up." Again. She was right. Todd Beckett, my ex-husband, the name I had once tried to forget by every possible means, had come back. The old silver-gray truck, the look that once stirred something in me but now only raised goosebumps. He always found a way to stand there, leaning against his truck as if everything between us had simply been a misunderstanding, as if he still had the right to step into my life, even though a court had made it clear he did not. The restraining order was nothing more than a meaningless piece of paper. Nearly 1 full year had passed since our divorce became official. 6 months since I moved into the new apartment with my daughter Lily, but Todd refused to accept any of it. He kept showing up at the school gate, at the grocery store, even in front of the church I once brought my daughter to every Sunday. At first, the police seemed sympathetic. After the 3rd time I called, they hesitated. By the 5th, I could hear the exhaustion in their voices. They would come, he would disappear, and the cycle began all over again like an old, worn record spinning endlessly on a broken player. I reached for my bag and the stack of papers, my hand trembling slightly as I locked the car. The November wind swept across the pile, empty courtyard, cold enough to cut through the thin coat I had hurriedly pulled on when leaving the office. The parking lot was nearly deserted. The other teachers had gone home long ago. I lingered, pretending to focus on gradebooks and lesson plans, but the truth was I did not want to go home. I was afraid of going home, afraid of the silence inside the apartment where every shadow outside the window could be Todd's. Last week, I saw him standing under the street lamp across from my bedroom window, silent, looking up, his face hidden in darkness, except for the faint glow of his cigarette blinking like the eyes of a watching animal. My daughter Lily, 8 years old, knew nothing about this. I tried to shield her from it. To her, I was still the strong mother Claire, who taught literature and baked banana bread, but inside me, each time I crossed the threshold of our apartment, my heart tightened. I could not go on like this, yet I no longer knew what to do. The police had grown, tired, and my friends had begun to feel the same. I did not blame them. My life had long been a chain of warnings and vigilance, always checking the rearview mirror, always taking the long way home, always flinching when someone knocked on the door after dusk. I stood still for a moment, drew a long breath, then stepped into the school building. The last dry winds of the season swept along the stone walkway, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and wood smoke. Each step felt heavy. I thought about the tests waiting to be graded, the parent meeting on Thursday, the dinner I promised to cook for Lily, then realized I was thinking about everything except myself. Everything except the truth that I was slowly breaking from the inside, and that even though I had escaped an heirless marriage, I had not escaped the man within it, nor the shadows that followed him, still clinging to me day after day. Before we continue with the next part of the story, if something in this tale has touched your heart, take a moment to subscribe to Dear Single Mom so you never miss a moving and inspiring story shared each day. Tap like if you feel a connection with Claire. Share this video to spread the message to others who may also be quietly navigating their own difficult days. Where are you listening from? Leave a comment with the name of your city or town so we know how far this story has reached. Every share, every comment from you becomes a powerful source of encouragement, helping us bring more heartfelt, healing stories to those who need them most. And now, let us step into the second part of this stormy yet quietly miraculous journey. The road from school to home felt longer that evening, even though the drive took barely 20 minutes, and Lily sat in the back seat with her head resting against the window, humming softly along with the children's song she loved, while I tried to pretend everything was fine. In the rearview mirror, my eyes caught sight of an unfamiliar silver, gray car keeping a steady distance behind us. I could not tell whether it was the fading daylight or the fear-twisting shadows inside my mind, but in that moment a cold shiver ran straight down my spine. Todd had once driven a similar car, and the sense of being watched tightened around my chest like a sudden cramp. I turned right onto the river highway that led toward the Willilamett Bridge. A misty rain began to fall, and the streaks of water sliding down the windshield looked like beads of sweat slipping from my forehead in every direction. My grip on the steering wheel grew tighter as I forced myself to stay calm so Lily would not sense anything. The lights from the car behind us stayed steady, neither speeding up nor passing, only quietly watching. My fingers curled around the strap of the bag beside me where my phone and a small self-defense spray rested. The little gift Melissa had once slipped into my hand with a smile that was half a joke and half concern. As the car climbed the bridge, the golden glow of the city lights reflected against the dark water below, turning the scene strange and somber. The wind grew stronger across the bridge, and I felt the car tremble slightly beneath its force. And then it happened. A sharp explosive sound burst from the front of the car, and the steering wheel jerked violently to the right. I screamed before I even understood what I was doing, my hands twisting the wheel in a desperate attempt to regain control. The car veered wildly, stumbling like a wounded animal, the front right tire blown apart, slamming us hard against the guardrail. Lily screamed from the back seat. I reached back instinctively to shield her just as the car tilted right, scraping along the rail before tipping fully. For a suspended, breathless instant weight disappeared, and then came the fall. The car shot off the bridge like a stone flung from a sling. I felt the brief moment when the wheels left the ground, when everything went silent, and I thought of Lily, of her small face, and wondered if I was about to die with my child in my arms. What followed was chaos. A violent crash, glass shattering, metal crying out like a torn spirit. Water rushed in, icy and unforgiving. Pain shot through my arm, my knee slammed against something sharp, and above it all was the sound of Lily crying, drowning out every other noise. I fought with the seatbelt and reached for her in the rising water. The door on my side was wedged tight, refusing to move. I pounded against the window, struggling as the car sank, heavy as the life I had been carrying. A sudden beam of light cut through the darkness. Someone was there. I could hardly believe my eyes. A figure in the rain, illuminated by headlights streaming down from the edge of the bridge, was moving toward us. Metal groaned as the door was torn open with impossible strength. A firm arm reached in, gripping my hand, pulling hard. I heard the rush of water, Lily coughing, and then my whole body was lifted into the bitter cold air. The man dragged both me and Lily to the shore, as if we weighed nothing, as if he had been born to do exactly that. I lay on my back on the wet pavement, gasping, my chest straining as if it might burst. Lily was wrapped in a thick jacket, clinging to me. The man knelt beside us, his face hidden in the shifting shadows and trembling lights, yet his eyes unmistakable. No fear, no panic, only a quiet, steady calm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and rough, yet holding something that made me trust him. I nodded, though my vision still blurred with water and fear. I did not know who he was or why he appeared at that exact moment in the rain on the bridge where I should have died, but I knew with a strange certainty that he was not an ordinary man, and that my life from that moment on would no longer be ordinary. The white light on the ceiling blurred as I opened my eyes, my lids heavy as if I had just clawed my way out of a deep, endless nightmare. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the steady beeping of a heart monitor pulled me back into the present. An unfamiliar ceiling, pale curtains, an unusual quiet. I was no longer wet and cold. My body was warm under a thick blanket and an IV needle rested in my arm. It took me a few seconds to remember what had happened. The Willilamett Bridge, the car, Lily, the crash, the cold water. The man. I jolted upright in panic, tugging the IV line so sharply that the machine let out a shrill alarm. The door opened almost immediately and a nurse rushed to my side, gently easing me back down. She told me Lily was safe in the room next door, only scratched and sleeping soundly. Tears slipped from my eyes, not from pain but from relief. I nodded in gratitude, unable to speak. After a few minutes, when my breathing settled, the door opened again. This time it was a man. He entered without noise or haste, yet each step carried a quiet pull that stirred the stillness of the room into something almost alive. He was tall and strong, dressed in a simple white shirt and a charcoal coat, his dark hair still damp as though he had walked straight out of last night's storm. But it was his eyes that held me. Gray and cool, deep as a winter lake, yet beneath that surface lay something warm and steady, slow in its certainty. I recognized him at once as the man who had pulled me from the sinking car, the man in the shadows on the bridge. I opened my mouth to speak, but he began first. "I am sorry to come in without warning. My name is Marco Santoro. You do not remember me, but I am the one who..." He paused as if refusing to use the word saved, then gave a faint smile. I nodded. My voice caught. Thank you. Without you. He shook his head gently, telling me I did not need to finish. What mattered was that my daughter and I were safe. I looked around the room again, trying to understand why I was not in the city hospital but here. There was no hospital logo on the nurse's uniform, no familiar noise, only a quiet that seemed almost intentional. I asked softly where I was. Marco answered simply that this was a private medical facility under his management, and I did not need to worry about cost or paperwork. Everything had been handled. His voice was calm, measured, as if the situation rested securely within his reach. I drew back slightly without meaning to. Part of me knew I should feel grateful, yet another part felt wary. A stranger had not only rescued me but brought me to a private place he controlled, assuring me everything was arranged. I was not used to being protected. I was even less used to losing control. Marco seemed to sense this. He kept a respectful distance, his expression composed, with the steady presence of someone who could read the slightest shift in another's emotions. I asked quietly how he knew to rescue us. He was silent for a moment before saying he had simply been crossing the bridge, just a coincidence, as though fate had arranged it. His voice held no laugh, yet it was not cold, a very light kind of humor that unsettled me in a gentle way. Something about him made me want to trust him, even as my reason warned me to be careful. Marco checked his watch and said he should let me rest, but that if I needed anything, all I had to do was ring the bell. He would visit Lily later if I allowed it. I nodded, unsure whether it was politeness or something deeper rising inside me. When he left the room, I could still feel the echo of him in the air. For the first time in many months, I felt no fear, only exhaustion and safety. And even though I did not yet understand who this man was, I knew something with quiet conviction. He had not appeared in my life to vanish like a passing rainstorm. Our story, I sensed, had only begun. I woke again the next morning in that same quiet white room, sunlight drifting through a sheer curtain. The dizziness had faded, and only a deep, worn-out tiredness remained like the aftershock of a storm. My arm still ached, but my heartbeat was steady. I sat up, took a slow breath, and looked around as if I needed to confirm that I was alive. And more than that my daughter was alive with me. Lily slept peacefully in the small bed beside mine, holding tightly to a stuffed bear I did not remember bringing. Her face was calm, as if the terror of the night before had already slipped away like a vanishing dream. For a child, it might have been just a nightmare that would dissolve with time. For me, it was carved so deep that each blink brought back the moment the car broke free of the bridge and fell into darkness. Around mid-morning, the door to the room opened again. Marco returned, this time dressed in a dark shirt and a short tailored coat, looking as if he had just stepped out of an important meeting, yet still carrying that quiet gentleness that was so hard to define. He paused at the doorway, asked how Lily was, then looked at me as if waiting for permission to come in. I gave a small nod. He stepped closer and handed me a cup of hot tea the nurse had just prepared. I took it, my hand still slightly unsteady, but no longer guarded like the day before. He sat in the leather chair beside the bed, his fingers laced calmly on his lap, his gaze as steady as ever. "I'd like to speak with you about what happened last night," he began, "but only if you're ready." I shook my head, my voice hoarse. "It's fine. I need to hear it." He studied me for a moment, then continued, his voice low and deliberate. "Your car didn't lose a tire by accident. There are signs of tampering. I had someone examine it, and I believe someone deliberately caused that crash. It was no coincidence that it happened on the most deserted stretch of the bridge." I tightened my grip on the cup, the heat burning into my palms while a chill spread through my neck. Todd. The name burst into my mind like a reflex, sharp and undeniable. I didn't say it aloud, but Marco's eyes seemed to register it clearly. He nodded slightly, as though affirming a truth I wasn't ready to say out loud. "That's why I'd like to suggest you and your daughter move to a safer place, at least for now. Somewhere discreet, secure. My villa in the southern hills outside Eugene is private and well protected. I've already had rooms prepared. You can rest, gather yourself, and decide your next steps. I'm not here to pressure you, but after what's happened, I don't believe it's wise for you to return to your apartment." I sat in silence, my thoughts spinning. Part of me wanted to refuse, to hold on to the last remnants of my independence. But the other part, the larger and heavier one, was fear. I couldn't let Lily go through another night like the one before. And the truth was, I had no one left to turn to. Melissa had her own family, and the police had long since grown weary of my file, stacking it quietly with the rest marked pending. I looked at Marco. This man remained a mystery, but he had saved me, saved my child. He asked for nothing in return, offered no conditions, no pity in his eyes, only understanding and patience. I knew I was about to step into his world, a world far removed from my own. But if that world was the only safe place I could take my daughter to, then I was willing to trade every doubt for the chance. I nodded, small and slow, a quiet agreement. He didn't say anything more. He stood, pulled a phone from his pocket, and spoke a few brief words in Italian to someone on the other end. When he put the phone away, he turned back to me. His eyes were no longer those of a stranger. They belonged to someone who had just accepted a responsibility far deeper than any promise. "Rest today," he said. "Tomorrow I'll take you both there." I nodded again, this time more certain. And in that moment, I knew I had opened a door that neither of us would be able to close easily. The black SUV turned silently onto a narrow dirt road winding through a forest of tall pines. Early winter wind moved through the branches above, creating a steady whispering sound, like a quiet and sorrowful melody played low in the background. I sat in the back seat, holding Lily close in my arms, my eyes fixed on the landscape unfolding ahead. We had left the medical facility early that morning, just as Marco had arranged. He didn't come with us, but sent a private driver in his place. The man, whose name was Vincent, was quiet, polite, and impeccably punctual. Lily had fallen asleep against my chest, her breathing soft and even, like a whispered comfort amid the chaos of the past few days. When the car finally came to a stop, I lifted my head and saw the villa appear beyond the trees, like a painting hidden deep within the forest, entirely removed from the outside world. The house rose before me like something pulled from a quiet European countryside, a 3-story structure of weathered gray stone, black-tiled roof, and arched windows, framed by white curtains that fluttered gently in the early winter breeze. It was not the kind of opulence that shouted, but rather the kind that whispered refined, thoughtful, and precise in every detail. The stone courtyard stretched wide in front, flanked on either side by old wrought iron lampposts, standing like sentinels leading toward the main door. Off to the left, partially veiled by pines and ivy, stood a smaller building that resembled an old chapel, its stone walls blanketed in climbing vines. The entire scene held a kind of sacred stillness, a beauty so hushed it left me unsure whether to feel peace or caution. I stepped out of the car, my feet meeting the cold stone, my eyes scanning everything around me as though I had just crossed into another world altogether. The main door opened before I could knock. A woman in her early 60s appeared, her face softened by age and kindness, her smile gentle and familiar like someone you didn't know but somehow trusted. She introduced herself as Elena, Marco's longtime housekeeper. Her voice was soft but assured, and she took our bags with an ease that made it feel like she'd done this 100 times before. Lily was still sleeping, so I lifted her in my arms and followed Elena inside. The villa's interior was an unexpected harmony of old and new. The walnut floors shone dark and smooth beneath my feet. The marble fireplace crackled with steady flame, and large oil paintings of seascapes and wild forests adorned the walls. There was something in the house that felt warm and lived in, yet unmistakably private, as though it had borne witness to stories that no one had ever dared to speak aloud. Elena led me up to the second floor, where 2 bedrooms sat side by side, each with tall windows looking out into the woods, white linens folded neatly over thick quilts, and a soft light that bathed the room in calm. I laid Lily down, tucking the blanket over her small frame, then pressed a kiss to her forehead. Elena told me to rest, that dinner would be ready soon. I nodded my thanks, though my eyes had already drifted toward the hallway window. From there I could see the chapel again, the one I had glimpsed through the trees when we first arrived. For some reason, it seemed to be waiting. I asked Elena if I might take a short walk. She smiled and said no one visited the chapel these days, but Marco still kept it carefully tended. I made my way down the stone path that wound gently through the pines. The scent of damp grass, pine resin, and a faint trace of wood smoke lingered in the cold air like a memory. The wooden door creaked slightly as I pushed it open. Inside, the silence was complete. Rows of wooden pews lined the aisle. A granite altar stood ahead, and above it, a large wooden cross hung, still and solemn. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the floor with shifting patterns of angels and color. I walked slowly, each step echoing softly on the feeder, worn stone, as though the floor itself remembered every footfall that had passed before me. An old Bible sat closed on the lectern. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, still, watching. This place was no longer a house of ritual. It had become something quieter, a space for reflection, for people like me to stop, to breathe deeply, and to ask themselves how much farther they could keep going. That night, as I sat beside the bedroom window, watching the glow of light spilling softly from the chapel below, I realized something I hadn't felt in months. I hadn't checked the locks 3 times. I hadn't peeked through the curtain to see if someone was standing outside in the dark. Here, in this place, everything was so still, so utterly calm, that I could not be certain it was real. But one thing I knew, without question, was that I was somewhere I had never imagined I'd be. And whatever this place was, even if it was only temporary, it was the safest I had felt since the day I walked away from Todd. The first 3 days at the villa passed in a stillness so complete, it almost felt unreal. In the mornings, I would take Lily for walks around the back garden. She delighted in gathering pine needles, sometimes running circles around the base of a towering old tree, as if every trace of fear had been lifted from her. I used the quiet moments while she napped to clear my thoughts, or simply sat by the window, watching the pine forest exhale its breath into a fine mist, trying to convince myself that life had returned to some kind of normal. But the truth was, the longer I stayed in this perfectly ordered air, the more I felt that this house was unlike any I had ever known. I started noticing the small things. A man in a black suit stood behind the chapel every morning, his eyes never straying far from the main gate. A woman with cropped hair appeared, each time I stepped into the garden, watering plants, but looking at her phone more than the soil. No matter where I went on the estate, someone was always nearby, never intrusive, never overt, but never coincidental either. I asked Elena about it. She smiled gently and said Marco was a careful man, especially when there were guests in the house. When I pressed further, she only offered one short but telling sentence. He is not like most people. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, I found Marco in the grand library on the ground floor. He was reading, the soft yellow light of a desk lamp casting a warm glow across the pages and sharpening the clean lines of his face. I hadn't meant to interrupt, but when he looked up and saw me, something in his eyes softened. "Trouble sleeping?" he asked. I nodded and stepped inside. The library looked like a wing of some forgotten museum, with shelves that reached the ceiling, books arranged by a system I couldn't begin to guess. I stood there for a moment, then asked, my voice low but clear, "The people around this house, who are they?" Marco watched me for a long while, as if measuring how much truth he was willing to lay bare. Eventually, he closed his book and motioned for me to take the chair across from him. "I have a private security network," he began. "Not because I enjoy showing off, but because I need it. My work requires it." I sat in silence, waiting for him to go on. Marco didn't hedge. He met my eyes directly. "I work in international trade, but at times, the people I deal with are not the kind you see giving interviews on television. There are things I can't fully explain, and I don't expect you to understand all of it. But there's one thing I want you to know. I am not a criminal. I don't traffic drugs. I don't traffic people. But I live in the space between what is legal and what is not, where every decision carries a cost." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Part of me wanted to rise and walk out right then. But the other part, the part that had watched this man leap into freezing water to save me, and my daughter told me to stay. I asked, "Why did you help me?" Marco didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze growing distant. "Because I know what it feels like to be pushed into a corner. Because I had a mother like you, and I couldn't do anything when she needed me most. I won't let that happen again. Not to anyone else." I didn't know what to say to that. I only knew that the man sitting before me was not just a rescuer. He was a mystery. A man who lived in a world I had never touched, yet the only one who had made me feel like I was no longer being hunted, at least, not here, not now. I stood, nodded in farewell, and stepped out of the library. As the door clicked shut behind me, I heard the sound of pages turning again, as if our conversation had never happened. But inside me, everything had changed. Marco Santoro was not a normal man, and I was beginning to understand that if I chose to stay here, I too would never be quite the same woman I had been before. That night, I couldn't sleep. After the conversation with Marco in the library, my thoughts tangled into knots I couldn't loosen. I slipped out of the room, bare feet touching the dark wooden floor of the hallway, letting the silence wrap around me like a shroud. Lily slept deeply, peacefully, like an angel wrapped in warmth and dreams, while I moved through the house like a shadow, a figure without a place. I didn't know why I found myself walking toward the back terrace, where a long bench overlooked the pine forest. A thin veil of mist hung across the treetops, and moonlight sifted through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the cold earth. I sat down, pulling my coat tightly around me, my fingers clenched together, stiff with cold. And then I heard footsteps behind me, slow, measured. Marco. He said nothing at first. He simply sat beside me, keeping a distance that respected my space, but close enough that I did not feel alone. I glanced at him and caught sight of the small gun holstered at his side, half visible beneath his open coat. He didn't flaunt it. He didn't hide it. It was simply part of him, like a shadow that someone who walks in darkness must always carry. I let out a soft, brittle laugh, my voice rough from the chill. I've never sat next to a man with a gun and felt safe before. Marco didn't smile. He only asked, gently, "What's keeping you awake?" That simple question somehow touched the fragile barrier I had fought to hold for years. I took a deep breath, and I began to speak. Not with anger, but with exhaustion. I told him about the years with Todd, how he changed after we married, how it began with quiet criticisms, then yelling, then fists slammed on tables, then fingers tightening around my wrists, and every time, he would apologize. Every time, he would promise to change. I wanted to believe him, because I thought I had to keep a family together for Lily. But then came the first real blow. Not a slap. A punch. I lay on the kitchen floor, arms covering my head, and Lily, only 5 years old, stood there watching, wide-eyed, not crying, just watching. That was the moment I knew I had to leave. I told Marco about the night I took Lily and left with nothing but 2 small suitcases and some cash. About the cheap apartment, the night classes I taught to make ends meet. About how every sound in the hallway made my heart race. I told him that there were days I wasn't sure I'd make it to the end of the month. Nights I sat in the bathroom with the water running just to drown out the sound of my sobbing so Lily wouldn't hear. I didn't speak to be pitied. I spoke because, for the first time, someone was truly listening. Without judgment, without rushing to fix anything. Marco said nothing. He didn't interrupt. He didn't reach out. He simply sat beside me, as silent and steady as the trees behind us. I turned to look at him, really look at him, and for the first time I asked, "Have you ever killed someone?" Not because I wanted to judge him, but because I needed to understand. He looked at me, and his eyes did not waver. His voice was low, steady, and cold in its honesty. "I've done things I'm not proud of, but I've never harmed anyone who didn't deserve it. In my world, silence can kill faster than a bullet." I didn't flinch. I didn't recoil. If anything, I understood him more in that moment than I had before. I whispered, "I'm tired of being the strong one. Everyone tells me I'm brave, that I'm capable. But they don't know that sometimes, I just want someone to stand beside me and say, 'I'll watch your child tonight. You just rest.' I'm so tired, Marco. Sometimes I just want to disappear for a few hours. Not forever. Just enough to stop pretending I have the strength to do this alone." Marco tilted his head, his voice barely louder than the wind in the trees. "Then tonight, let me be that person. Just tonight, if you'll let me." I looked at him for a long time, and in the eyes of the man who wore a gun like a second skin, I didn't see danger. I saw something I hadn't let myself believe in for a long time: protection. And the quiet promise that, at least for now, I didn't have to face the darkness alone. The next morning, when I came down to the kitchen, I found Lily perched on a high stool, her small legs swinging above the floor. Both hands wrapped around a cup of chocolate milk, the kind she always asked for whenever she was tired or still half asleep. Marco stood with his back to us, sleeves rolled up, forearms steady and strong as he quietly sliced fruit onto a plate. The breakfast table was already perfectly arranged. Eggs, toast, fruit, and even bear-shaped waffles that I knew without question he could not have come up with unless he'd asked Lily what she liked. I stood there for a few seconds, saying nothing, simply watching, feeling something I hadn't let myself feel in a day, long time. It was like someone had quietly placed back inside my chest, a missing shard of peace I thought had been lost forever. Lily was chewing a bite of waffle, telling a story in her soft voice. Marco listened with genuine attention, nodding now and then, letting out the occasional laugh, his eyes softening every time she looked up, seeking a reaction. When I finally stepped into the room, Lily turned to me and said something so light, yet it stopped me in my tracks. "Mommy, Mr. M said if it doesn't rain today, He'll show me how to tie knots like in survival camp." Marco smiled then, turning to greet me with a simple nod. His gaze wasn't overly warm, not familiar in a way that felt too close, but it held something steady, something reassuring. I looked at Lily, then at Marco, and repeated the name in my mind. Mr. M. Not Uncle Marco. Not Mr. Santoro. Just Mr. M. It was a name half formal, half personal, spoken with the kind of affection that a child uses when they trust someone enough to let them close, but not so close that it might hurt. I couldn't remember the last time Lily had laughed so much. Maybe it was before Todd began to spiral out of control. Maybe it was during a summer afternoon at her grandmother's house, when she was still too young to understand her parents no longer loved each other. I watched as Marco knelt to tie Lily's shoelaces, the motion quiet and precise, not rushed, not performative, just careful, like he'd done it 1,000 times before, but I knew he hadn't. He once told me his mother died young. His father was always away. So where had this patience come from? This tenderness? I didn't ask. I just sat down next to my daughter and listened as she told me that yesterday Mr. M had shown her how to tell the wind's direction using a leaf. That she was pretty sure he used to be a spy. I laughed. Really laughed. For the first time in weeks. Marco just shrugged, his expression offering neither confirmation nor denial. He looked at me then, and in his eyes was something warmer than anything he could have said aloud. From that day forward, Lily began trailing Marco every chance she got. It wasn't always some grand activity. Sometimes they just walked through the garden. Sometimes they sat by the small pond behind the house to watch the fish swim. Sometimes they read books together in the library. Lily told me that Mr. M reads slowly, but always finds the best parts. That he never forgets a promise, not even a small one, like finding her a blue flower. I watched the strange connection growing between them, and I couldn't deny that something inside me, something deep and stubborn, was slowly beginning to soften. Not because of big gestures, but because of how consistent Marco was in his presence. He didn't try to win Lily over. He didn't bribe her with toys or flatter her with sweet words. He was just there, at the right moments, for long enough, quiet enough, like a steady tree, rooted and still, that a child could lean against without ever worrying it might fall. That night, after I tucked the blanket around Lily, she turned toward me and whispered, "Mommy, Mr. M is a good person, right?" I paused for a breath, then stroked her hair and answered softly, "Yes, I think he is." She nodded and closed her eyes, her face settling into the calm ease of a child who had just placed a small new trust in the world. I stayed beside her for a long time, watching the little girl I had tried so hard to shield from every harm, now opening her heart to a man I still did not fully understand. But the truth, clear and steady as breath, was that if Lily could trust him, perhaps I could begin to let myself trust again too. Not with logic, but with the deepest instinct of a mother who had lived too long with fear. And this time, I felt no fear at all. It began on a morning that seemed peaceful enough, when dew still clung to the grass and Lily had just waved goodbye before running into her classroom, with her tiny purple backpack bouncing behind her. I stood beside the car, watching her until she disappeared behind the row of classrooms, a habit I hadn't been able to let go. I was about to get into the car when my eyes caught something that froze me from head to toe, as if someone had poured a bucket of ice water over me. Across the school gate, just behind the iron fence, Todd stood there. He leaned against a lamppost, arms crossed, wearing that slow, taunting smile. I knew too well. He didn't speak. He didn't step forward. He simply watched me, as though savoring the fear that spread over my face. The old jacket, the slightly longer hair, the thinner frame, none of it mattered. His eyes were the same eyes that had haunted those dark years. He lifted his hand in a gesture that was half greeting, half reminder that he had never truly left. I don't remember how I got into the car. Only that my hands shook so violently I dropped my keys twice, and when I finally shut the door, my breath was so shallow it felt like there was no air left in the world. I fumbled for my phone and called Marco on instinct. He answered after the first ring. "Claire, what happened?" His voice was low and controlled, but I heard the alertness instantly. I swallowed hard, struggling to keep the panic out of my voice. "Todd, he's here, outside the school." Marco was silent for one long, sharp second, as if containing a fury of his own. Then his voice turned cold. "Do not get out of the car. Lock the doors. I'm sending people now." I looked outside again. Todd was still there, not coming closer but not leaving either, standing at that perfect distance where the law could not touch him. He didn't enter the school grounds. He didn't approach me. He simply stood there, far enough to avoid consequences, yet close enough to remind me he could still control me with nothing more than his presence. Fear twisted inside me, rising the way it had so many times before, a familiar, invisible hand tightening around my ribs. I hated that he could still paralyze me just by standing still. A black SUV appeared at the end of the street a few minutes later, moving quickly, but without drawing attention. I recognized the license plate. Marco's men. 2 plainclothes men stepped out, quiet and deliberate, their eyes scanning the area with sharp precision. Todd saw them. His face changed. The smirk vanished. He stepped back twice, then slipped into a narrow alley behind the residential block. He disappeared within seconds, like a shadow that knew exactly when to retreat. One of Marco's men approached my car and tapped gently on the window. "Miss Claire, we'll escort you home now." I nodded, though my hands still trembled. When I reached the villa, Marco was already waiting at the front steps. He didn't speak at first. He stepped closer and set a steady hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "Did he touch you?" "No." He just stood there. Marco's grip tightened slightly, steadying both himself and me. "This will not happen again." He turned to Joseph, who had appeared silently behind him. "From today on, Lily gets 2 full-time guards. Claire as well. Even on school grounds. No exceptions." I shook my head on reflex. "Marco, that will draw attention." He studied me for a long moment, then spoke slowly. "Attention is better than danger. He has crossed a line. He is escalating." I took a shaky breath. He looked at me like I still belonged to him, like the past 6 months meant nothing. Marco's eyes held no trace of the cold calculation of the man who moved through the shadows of an unspoken world. What I saw was anger held back only because of me. He no longer belongs anywhere in your life. Anyone can see that, except him. The words hit the very fear I had been trying so hard not to name. Todd did not accept losing control, and he would not stop. Lily was now within his reach. "We'll protect her," Marco said, as if he had heard the fear I had not voiced. His hand rested on my back, gentle yet certain. "He will not come near either of you again." I nodded, but deep inside, a cold understanding spread through me. Todd had not come just to frighten me. He was preparing for something worse, and the most dangerous part was not knowing when it would strike, only that the darkness had returned. And this time, it was no longer coming for me alone. I woke near midnight to the violent buzzing of my phone beneath the pillow, the wind outside pressing through the pines with a low, restless moan that made the air in the room feel colder than it should. The screen lit the ceiling with a pale flicker, an unfamiliar number pulsing again and again. My hands trembled as I slid open the video call, an uneasy instinct rising inside me like a thin smoke slipping through the cracks of my heart. The first image froze my breath. Lily. She sat in a dim room, a single weak yellow bulb spilling light across her tangled hair. Her wrists were loosely bound, her eyes wide with terror yet dry, too frightened even to cry. A strip of tape covered her mouth, but the plea in her gaze tore straight through me. No sound, no words, only shaky footage filmed with intention. Then the frame jolted as someone stepped into view. Todd. He entered from the right, dressed in a black jacket, hair slicked back, his eyes filled with a hatred so dense it seemed to thicken the air around him. He looked into the camera and smiled with that slow, triumphant curl I knew too well. Then he spoke, his voice low and stretched, carving each word deliberately. "Claire, if you're watching this, then you know what's happening. I waited for you to wake up. I waited for you to come back, but you chose to run. You let our daughter call another man Mr. M. You think I would stand by and watch that?" He leaned down, placing his hand on Lily's shoulder. She flinched, her small body shivering. My composure shattered. Tears fell onto the screen, my hand shaking, so hard I nearly dropped the phone. Todd looked straight at me as though he could see me through the lens. "You have 24 hours. Either you leave Marco Santoro and leave Eugene alone without her, or I send you the next part. Believe me, Claire. I do not bluff." The call ended before I could speak. The screen went black, leaving only the fierce pounding of my heart like blows inside my ears. I do not remember how I left my room, only that I shouted for Marco, running barefoot down the cold hallway, nearly collapsing as I reached the front hall. Marco was already there as if he had never slept. He caught me as I stumbled, and I thrust the phone into his hands, tears still blurring my vision. He watched the video, his face unmoving, his body going rigid as stone. When it ended, he turned sharply and called out, "Joseph." A door opened at once. Joseph appeared, expression unchanged, eyes alert, and already armed with readiness for the worst. Marco issued orders with a voice like steel. Activate the full emergency tracking system. Check every camera around the school and every route taken today. Shut down all internal leaks. Find out how he got past the gate. Joseph glanced at the preliminary report and replied quickly. A substitute teacher was on duty. Todd used an old emergency ID card the school failed to confiscate during the chaotic dismissal time. Marco's jaw tightened. Anyone who knew Lily's movements today, I want that list in 5 minutes. Joseph nodded and vanished like a shadow torn away by force. I sank onto the stairs, stripped of every ounce of strength. Why would he do this? Why her? Marco sat beside me, his hand resting firmly on my back, his voice deep and impossibly calm. Because he knows you're not afraid for yourself. He can only hurt you by touching the person you love most. I buried my face in my hands, my whole body trembling. Lily, she must be so terrified. What do I do? Should I give myself up? I cannot let her be alone with him. Marco tightened his grip on my shoulder. You won't have to do anything alone. I won't let him get away. But in his eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. A fracture. Not fear, but rage. A kind of fury so cold it became a frightening calm. He stood and called 3 more men into the security room. They gathered around a digital map, and Marco began to issue commands with the ease and precision of someone who had seen more than one war. His voice was crisp, authoritative, his words falling into place like pieces on a battlefield. I watched him, overwhelmed, clinging to a fragile thread of hope that if there was one person in this world capable of bringing my daughter back, it was him. But inside, I understood. This was no longer just between me and Todd. This was a collision between a man who had lost all reason and a man who carried an empire behind his silence. And I, caught between those two worlds, had only one wish: to hold my daughter again, just once more. Before it was too late. The satellite map illuminated the large screen in the villa's security room, glowing with red markers crawling across the mountainous terrain of Oregon like scattered drops of blood. Marco stood still, his eyes locked on the section of forest encircled in a thick red line. Joseph approached with a file freshly printed from the tracking system. A small gray van had been detected near the school around the time Lily left class. No license plate, no record through official checkpoints. But the heat scanner picked up human signatures in the back of the van, separated from the driver's cab. Based on movement and speed, the vehicle had stopped in the southeastern hills near an old cabin previously rented under an anonymous contract. Marco said nothing. He simply nodded and signaled for Joseph to prepare the cars. Then he turned and looked at me. I sat frozen on a nearby chair, my hands clasped so tightly they had gone white. You can't come with us, Claire. I'll bring Lily back. I stood up instantly. You can't go alone. He rested his hand on my shoulder, voice low but resolute. I'm not going alone. I've got 6 men with me, my most trusted team. Every one of them trained like special forces. Do you trust me? I looked into his eyes. There was a weight in that question that wasn't just about Marco. It was about trust in the unknown. In everything I could not see, could not predict. I nodded, very slightly. But it was enough. The drive was silent. Marco sat in the second SUV of a 3-vehicle convoy, with Joseph and 2 others in the back seat, armed with lock breakers, short-range rifles, and encrypted earpieces. The mountain roads twisted sharply, the darkness beyond the headlights swallowing everything in its path. Wind howled against the windows, pushing against the steel like something alive. Just before midnight, they reached a clearing near a steep slope. The map showed the cabin was only 600 meters ahead, hidden, beyond the trees. No lights, no sounds. But thermal scanners confirmed 2 heat signatures inside, one smaller still, one larger pacing near the eastern window in uneven intervals. Marco gave silent orders, hand signals slicing through the air, 2 to the left flank, 2 to the right. Joseph stayed with Marco. They would go through the front. All comms switched to a private channel. No one spoke, only the quiet crunch of boots on dry forest floor, the rustle of gear, the brush of gunmetal against jackets. Marco stopped behind the final thicket before the cabin. Through night vision, he scanned the room. Faint light spilled from a single overhead bulb. Lily lay on a long bench, wrists still bound, head lifted, eyes darting. She was awake. That meant there was still time. Todd sat slouched in a chair near the window, a beer bottle in one hand, his back against a splintered wooden seat. He didn't know they were there. Marco counted silently. 1, 2, 3. The door burst, open with a single, precise kick. Joseph stormed in first, weapon raised and aimed directly at Todd, who froze before he could react. Marco moved fast, crossing the room in 3 strides and dropping to his knees beside Lily. He cut the ropes quickly. Her eyes widened in recognition, then filled with silent tears. She collapsed against him, unable to speak through her sobbing. Marco lifted her into his arms and held her close, tightening his grip just enough to say, "I've got you. You're safe." Todd let out a roar and tried to rise, but before he could take a single step, a third man from the rear team slammed him to the ground, twisted his arm behind his back, and pinned him with brutal efficiency. It was over in less than 2 minutes. Not a single bullet fired, not a single injury. But everyone in that room knew this silence was only the calm before the storm. When Marco returned to the villa with Lily in his arms, I was already waiting by the door, and the moment I saw her, my child, my baby, I broke. I cried as if I had never cried before, as if all the years I had spent holding it in finally demanded release. Marco placed her gently into my arms, as if he were returning a piece of my soul that had gone missing and had now been found. I held her tightly, felt her heartbeat pounding against my chest, fast and fierce, like a drum insisting she was still here, still mine, still untouched by the dark that had come so close to swallowing her. Marco stood nearby, his eyes locked on both of us. He didn't speak. But for the first time, the cold edge in his gaze was gone. What remained was something quieter. Relief. The relief of a man who had pulled back from the brink and managed to reclaim what mattered most. And in that moment, I knew Marco hadn't just saved Lily. He was the one person I could hand the rest of my life to, if life still had room to hold a family as imperfect as ours. The next morning, sunlight threaded through the pines behind the villa, thin golden strands piercing the early winter air. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at the quiet sky but thinking of somewhere far from it. Lily had finally managed to fall asleep again after a night of restless crying, jerking awake in fear, calling out for me, then curling deeper into my arms once she knew I was still there. Marco stayed just outside her door the entire night, pacing the hallway, stepping in every so often to check on her before retreating in silence. I knew he was fighting something inside himself. So was I. Todd had been taken into custody immediately after the raid. Marco didn't hand him over to just anyone. He called a city police chief named Alan, a man who owed him a life debt from a rescue mission years ago. Todd was taken alive, unharmed, and didn't resist. He said nothing, offered no excuses, no apology. When asked about his motives, he simply shrugged and said, "I just wanted my wife to come back. Wife." That's what he still called me, as though his memory refused to accept the truth that I no longer belonged to him. There was no mention of the kidnapping in the papers, thanks to Marco's influence. He wanted to protect Lily from the public eye, but I couldn't protect myself from the tide of memory that kept rising inside me, crashing over my mind in silent waves. I stood between 2 currents, one of hatred, a slow, steady burn that refused to die, and the other of fear, not for myself, but for Lily. How do you tell a child that her biological father is now in handcuffs, awaiting trial? How do you help her carry a truth like that without letting it define her? Marco understood. He didn't say much, but he never left my side. He gave me space, not pressure, silence long enough for me to fill when I was ready. Later that afternoon, he took me to his private attorney's office to discuss next steps. He asked me if I wanted to withdraw the complaint. I looked up at him and saw, in my own reflection, a woman both fragile and fierce. "I've forgiven too many times already, Marco. It's time I stood for myself, and for my daughter." He nodded once. He didn't ask again. A week later, I was summoned to the station for a confrontation. Through the one-way glass, I saw Todd. He was still the man I had once loved, once married, once believed would be the father of my child for a lifetime. But he was also the man who had choked the life out of me with hands that once pretended to offer love. I didn't enter the room. I simply stood there, watching him sit with his head bowed, his wrists cuffed, his face stripped of every trace of arrogance. A silent image I knew would never leave me. Marco stood beside me, saying nothing, just standing there with me. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I only felt a hollow place opening quietly in my chest, not from pity, but from the truth. The truth that the man I once called husband, the father of my child, was now nothing more than a fracture in my past. When we left the station, I turned to Marco. "I don't know when or how I'll tell Lily, He nodded. When you're ready. But if you need me, I'll be there. I looked at him, and for the first time since all of this began, I no longer felt like someone who had lost. I was no longer the woman running away. I was the mother who had stood up for her child. And no matter how many long nights lay ahead, no matter how long it took for Lily to understand, I knew I had made the right choice. Todd would face justice. And I would move forward, with my daughter, with a man who didn't promise never to hurt me, but who was willing to stand between me and every hurt that ever tried to return. That afternoon, after Lily had fallen into a deep sleep following her class at the center, I walked alone to the small chapel behind the villa. The old wooden door creaked open, letting in the scent of wax burned down to its wick and the faint trace of half-spent incense. I had never been a regular churchgoer. Faith, to me, had always felt like something vague, especially after everything I had lived through. But something about the stillness in that space quieted my heart. The stone walls held a lingering chill, and at the center of the empty room stood a long oak pew, worn with time. I sat in the front row, hands folded together, eyes on the statue of Christ above the altar. I didn't pray. I simply sat there, trying to name the question I had carried too long in silence. Father Thomas appeared behind me at some point. I didn't hear him arrive. The old priest had lived here for over 20 years, a man Marco trusted enough to keep this space sacred in the middle of the chaos he managed. He sat beside me and said nothing for a long while. Then, finally, in a voice rough like wind slipping through a narrow window, he said, "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Claire." I turned to him. His eyes held no judgment, no pity. Only the presence of someone who had witnessed more pain than most would care to imagine. "I don't think I can do it," I whispered. "I've fought to survive, to raise my daughter, to forget," but he didn't stop. He touched the most sacred part of my life. "How do I forgive that?" Father Thomas nodded, as if he understood that pain in a way that didn't need to be explained. There are people who don't deserve forgiveness. Not because they're unworthy, but because it would cost the last good part of the one they hurt. Forgiveness isn't for him. It's to release yourself. I lowered my head, hands tightening in my lap. I don't want Lily to grow up with the image of her father in handcuffs, waiting for trial. But I also don't want her to think silence is the way to face what's wrong. He looked at me for a long time, then asked quietly, "Do you believe in justice?" I answered, "I do. I just don't believe it always arrives when it should." He smiled, faintly. "Justice isn't always a sentence. Sometimes, it's simply standing in the truth without bowing your head. You've done that, and you're doing better than you think." I closed my eyes, letting my breath fall into rhythm with the soft chime of wind against the stained glass. His words weren't a cure, but they loosened the tightness fear had wrapped around my chest. Father Thomas placed his hand gently over mine. "Forgiveness is a journey, not a destination. Maybe today you're not ready, but don't close that door forever. Because someday, your daughter may need you to walk through it first, so she can learn what real freedom looks like." I opened my eyes and looked again at the statue before me. The face of Christ tilted slightly toward mine, not sorrowful, not condemning, only waiting. "I won't promise to forgive," I said, my voice rough. "But I promise not to let hate decide the course of my life anymore." Father Thomas nodded. "That's the first step, and the hardest one." When I stepped out of the chapel, the sun was sinking low near the edge of the horizon. The last light of day spilled gold across the back garden of the villa, where Lily often played with Marco each afternoon. I saw his silhouette waiting at the foot of the stone steps, his eyes scanning the forest from which I had just returned. I walked toward him slowly, my heart still heavy, but no longer tangled in invisible binds. I didn't know if I had forgiven, but I did know this: if that day ever came, forgiveness wouldn't be something I handed to Todd. It would be a gift I gave to myself. And to my daughter, who deserved to grow up in a world not governed by hatred. I left the chapel not with peace, but with clarity. That night, after putting Lily to bed, after soothing her into a safe dream beside her old stuffed bear, I went to find Marco in the library. He stood at the window, his back to me, the amber glow from the lamp catching the edge of his shoulder and the sharp lines of his posture, tight with thought. He turned as soon as he heard my footsteps. "Claire." His voice pulled me back into the present like a thread after a long, frayed day. I walked to him and sat down in the chair across from where he stood. I drew a long, steady breath. "I've made my decision." Marco didn't ask what it was. He simply waited. I spoke slowly, each word falling onto the wooden floor like a weight I was finally ready to release. "I'm taking Todd to trial." Marco didn't react with surprise. His expression remained calm, as if he had already known this was the path I would take. But in his eyes, I saw something more than understanding. I saw respect. He sat beside me, not touching, not crowding, but just near enough for me to know I wasn't alone. "Are you scared?" he asked. "Terrified," I said honestly. "But I can't let him do this again. Not to anyone. Not because I want revenge, but because Lily needs to see her mother stand up the right way." Marco nodded. He placed his phone on the table. A quiet gesture that signaled everything from this moment forward would be handled with precision. "He won't get away, Claire." He said it like a vow. Not out of vengeance, but from a belief in justice, the kind that doesn't wait, the kind that isn't softened by loopholes or lost in delays. I knew Marco had influence, and I knew he wasn't afraid to use it when it came to protecting the people he held close. But I also knew he would never cross the lines I set. He would never take the decision from me. But he would move heaven and earth to make sure that decision wasn't twisted. The next morning, I met with the attorney and signed the formal complaint, listing every charge that applied: domestic violence, unlawful surveillance, threats to life, child abduction. We submitted every piece of evidence: Todd's video message, traffic camera footage, the findings from the cabin. The attorney looked at me and said the case was solid. With evidence this clear, the sentence would be severe, and if Todd had any sense left, he would plead guilty to reduce it. I didn't respond. I didn't care what choice he made. For the first time in years, the legal system stood behind me, not because I was lucky, but because I had finally chosen to stand up for myself. The first hearing took place at the city courthouse. Todd appeared in prison garb, his hands shackled, flanked by 2 officers. He kept his head lowered, never once looking up, but I knew, somehow, he could feel I was there in that courtroom. I stood behind the glass, my hands gripping the back of the bench so tightly the knuckles turned white. Lily wasn't with me. I didn't want her to witness this moment. Marco stood just behind me, silent, yet his calm, steady breathing felt like an anchor I hadn't realized I needed so desperately. When the judge began reading the list of charges, Todd remained silent. It wasn't until his attorney urged him to plead guilty in hopes of a reduced sentence that he lifted his head and looked toward the glass. The eyes that had once softened for me now held only the void of bitterness. He did not plead guilty. I wasn't surprised. Men like him always believe they are misunderstood rather than wrong. But this time, that lie he told himself would not save him. When the judge denied bail and set a date for the trial, Todd clenched his jaw. Perhaps, in that very moment, he understood for the first time that control had slipped entirely from his grasp. As I stepped out of the courthouse, I paused on the top steps. A gust of wind swept by, cold but strangely weightless. Marco stood beside me, his gaze steady, offering nothing but the truth. "Claire, you did the right thing." I gave a small nod. "Yes." And no matter how much my heart trembled, no matter how deeply Todd's memory still carved at the edges of my mind, I knew I had severed the invisible chain that had bound me for so many years. A chapter had closed, not with revenge, but with justice. And for the first time in so long, I could breathe without pain. 3 months after Todd's final hearing, I stood in a sun-drenched classroom, a bundle of lesson plans in my hands, my eyes drawn to the window where Lily played with a handful of other children on the grassy lawn. This school was unlike any place I had ever taught before. There were no bells signaling the start of class, no pressure of rankings or walls plastered with achievement charts. It was a small community center on the southern edge of Eugene, funded by a newly formed organization called the Hopewell Foundation. The name was chosen by Marco himself. He said it meant hope beginning in the place where you once believed there was no way out. I still remember the night he first brought me here. The land was nothing but scattered construction materials. Marco stood in the middle of the open courtyard and spoke of a place where women who had once fallen apart could begin again without judgment, without having to lower their gaze. I looked at him without saying a word, but deep inside I knew that if anyone could turn a promise into something real, it was him. Now the walls were painted a soft beige. The large windows opened onto a garden of blooming flowers, and inside the small classrooms were young mothers, women who had dropped out of school because of an unexpected pregnancy, who had endured marriages that offered no way forward, who had once thought education belonged only to others. I was one of them. And now I stood before them, not as a grammar teacher, but as someone who had been broken and was still learning, day by day, how to piece herself back together with patience and kindness. The first lesson I wrote on the board was not from any textbook. Rewrite your story in your own language. That was what I wanted them to do before we even touched the past perfect tense. or the use of commas in compound sentences. I wanted them to know that their voices mattered, even if those voices had once trembled. Each morning, I walked to work with Lily by my side. She's adjusted better now, made a few new friends, and is always the first child to line up outside the classroom, her small feet tapping with quiet anticipation. There was a time when I feared she might never feel safe again, but I was wrong. Children have a way of healing that adults can barely comprehend. Lily never asks about her father anymore. The only question she brings to the dinner table now is whether Mr. M will be joining us tomorrow. Marco comes often, not abruptly, but never absent. He doesn't force his way into our lives. Instead, he walks beside it, like a patient carpenter laying one brick at a time for a home I never dared to dream of. One afternoon, after classes, I sat in the back garden with a few of my students. A woman named Rachel, around 35, had just completed a writing assignment about the moment she first knew she needed to leave her husband. When she finished reading, the group fell into a long silence, then applauded gently. No one offered platitudes, no one asked for more. But I saw the shimmer in Rachel's eyes, not of pain, but of release. I moved to sit beside her and took her hand in mine. She turned and whispered, "If it weren't for this place, I don't know what I would have done." I held her hand tighter and replied, "Neither do I." That evening, when we returned to the villa, Marco greeted the two of us in the foyer as he always did. He bent down to hug Lily, then looked at me with eyes that no longer wore the armor of a man shaped by the underworld. I told him about the day's lesson, about Rachel's story, about the quiet changes beginning to take root in the lives of women who once felt forgotten. Marco listened in silence, his eyes on me like he was hearing a song he never grew tired of. Then he said he wanted to open another center up north. "Do you think you could help train the teachers?" he asked. I smiled. "Not just the teachers. Also, the women learning how to begin again." Marco nodded. "Then that's where we'll start." And I knew, with a man like Marco, every beginning was real. Not because he was trying to make amends, but because he believed, as I had slowly come to believe, that healing is never just a private act. It is something you sow, every day, every hour, with the same hands that once trembled. And this place, this small school nestled in land long overlooked, was becoming proof of that, a place to rewrite yourself, word by word, line by line. Late February in Oregon carries a strange kind of light, not exactly sunlight, but not gloom either. Just a veil of brightness, as if the world had been sifted through a soft woolen screen, blurring the edges and making everything gentler. That afternoon, Marco asked me to come with him to the chapel tucked behind the small forest. He didn't say why, only that he had something to show me. Lily was at the center, and I had no reason to say no. Especially, with his gaze so still and clear, it felt like quiet water. We walked along a narrow trail, scattered with dead leaves and broken twigs, the ground beneath us still damp from the night's rain. Marco walked ahead, silent, his hands deep in the pockets of his coat. I followed, a touch uneasy because he was quieter than usual. When we reached the wooden chapel door, he stopped, turned to me, then pushed the door open and gestured for me to go inside first. The space within was still as simple as the first time I set foot in it. Wooden pews, high ceilings, and stained glass windows that cast streaks of violet and gold onto the stone floor. But something was different this time. On the first bench, where I usually sat, lay a small envelope placed with quiet care. I looked to Marco. He said nothing, just gave a small nod. I sat down, picked up the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, with no name, no title. I unfolded it and began to read. He never thought he would write a proposal. Everything he had ever done had always lived outside the borders of what most people would call normal, and he never believed he would get a second chance at life. But then you came, not like a burst of light, but like a quiet flame burning steadily through the night. You didn't change him. You made him want to change. Not to become someone else, but to become kind enough to walk beside you. No one ever taught him how to love someone like you, Claire. Someone brave yet fragile, wounded but still choosing to love. But he wanted to learn. Every day. Until the day you no longer wanted him to. If there were a way to say he wanted to walk with you through every morning, every rainy day, every courtroom, every rushed school drop-off, this was it. Not with a diamond ring. Not with poetic words, but with all that he had left in his heart. I finished reading and didn't lift my head right away. Something rose in my throat. Something without a name. something I could not control. When I finally looked up, Marco was kneeling. In his open palm was a small, deep blue velvet box. Inside was a delicate, vintage ring, a sea blue sapphire set between two small diamonds. He said it was his mother's, the only woman who had ever loved him unconditionally before I came into his life. His voice softened, almost trembled, as he told me he wanted it on the hand of the only woman who still made him believe the past could be repaired with the present. No more questions, no more words. I nodded, slowly, but with certainty, and in the moment Marco slid the ring onto my finger, I knew the cracks in my heart no longer ached. They had become the stitch marks that reminded me I had once hurt, once lost, but had also once been strong enough to rise again and choose love. When Marco stood and wrapped his arms around me, I didn't cry. I simply closed my eyes and listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a quiet calling my own heart had been answering for a long time, only now finding the courage to say it aloud. In the stillness of the chapel, beneath the shifting light from stained glass windows, I accepted a proposal without a single spoken word, and began a new chapter not with a grand ceremony, but with the quiet certainty that love doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to be real. The morning after I said yes, I woke earlier than usual. Soft light filtered through the sheer white curtains, touching the pillow, my shoulder, and the tousled hair of Lily sleeping beside me. She was fast asleep, arms wrapped around her worn stuffed bear. I stayed still, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, then turned gently to see Marco standing on the porch, his back to me, holding a cup of coffee. His shadow stretched long across the tiled floor. So calm, no one would ever guess that this man once belonged to a world where power and loyalty decided everything. I didn't call out to him. I simply lay there quietly, letting my heart drift into a feeling I had never quite known before. If it had a name, perhaps it would be peace. Life, after all the storms, turned out to be startlingly simple. Each morning I still walk to class, still prepare my lessons, still linger after school with the students who need to share something that never made it into a textbook. Marco continues to manage his work, though now with fewer long trips, fewer midnight calls, and more evenings spent at the dinner table. Sometimes it's just baking cookies with Lily, or watching an old movie, or standing quietly together watering the plants in the corner of the back garden. We do not live loudly, but everything has its rhythm, like a slow and honest melody. Lily has embraced this new life with a kind of quiet joy. She has friends now, weekend picnics with Marco and me, bedtime stories told in his low voice, which she says sounds like someone straight out of a cartoon. She has grown, not just in height but in the steadiness behind her eyes. I believe it is the peace in the adults around her that has helped her believe the world can be a safe place to exist. One evening at dinner, Lily suddenly asked, "Mama, if someone did something wrong but then lived a really good life after, could they be forgiven?" I paused for a moment. Marco looked at me, but didn't speak. I set down my spoon and answered gently, "Yes, if they truly change. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, my love. It just means choosing not to let what was wrong keep hurting you." Lily nodded, as if she understood, and went on eating without another word. But I knew that answer was not only for the past, it was also for whatever might come. I began to allow myself to live more truthfully, no longer hesitating to speak of what had happened, no longer feeling ashamed of once being a single mother struggling to find her place. I started writing again, small pieces, stories I shared with my students, and soon the shape of a book began to form in my mind, something for women finding their way out of the dark. Marco supported me, not with grand declarations, but by quietly sending research materials, reaching out to a few friends in publishing, and placing a small writing desk by the library window where each morning I could sit with a cup of tea and my own words. No one pushed anyone to be perfect. We simply lived, one day at a time, and let time answer the things we hadn't yet figured out. Spring arrived earlier than usual. Cherry blossoms bloomed wide across the front yard. Children ran barefoot through the grass, their laughter mingling with the soft chimes swaying on the porch. I stood at the window, a half-finished book in hand, and watched the scene like it was a painting I never imagined I'd step into. I hadn't wished for a life like this, but it came, quietly, slowly, like the morning light slipping through the window, to wake me with a kind of peace that has no name. And in that moment, I knew my dream had never been something grand. It had always been this simple: to live, to love, to be heard. To have someone like Marco, a child like Lily, and a version of myself that was growing, Not for anyone else, but for my own becoming. That dream has a name. It is called peace. And now, I am living in it. I first began to notice it on a morning thick with fog. As I made my way down to the kitchen to prepare breakfast for Lily, I didn't see Marco in the living room, where he usually sat with his coffee, the soft hum of his presence grounding the house. The lights were still off. The mug he always used was bone dry, untouched. But the small door leading out back, the one that opened onto the narrow trail into the woods, stood slightly ajar. I pulled on a coat and followed the path, damp leaves soft beneath my feet, and I knew immediately where he was. The chapel still stood there, solitary in the misty clearing, like an anchor in a land I once believed held nothing but danger and shadows. Its door was left slightly open. I hadn't meant to step inside, but then I heard his voice soft, almost imperceptible, not speaking but breathing words into the silence. Marco was praying. It was not a sight I was used to. A man who had once walked through the underworld, whose decisions had once made others tremble, now stood with his head bowed, fingers laced together, alone in that small, quiet space like a lost boy returning to the only shelter he could still believe in. I didn't catch every word he said, but I heard my name. I heard Lily's, and I heard it again, more clearly this time. Peace. He was praying for peace, not for himself, for us. I turned away quietly, not wanting to disturb what felt sacred. But from that day forward, I began to notice he did it every morning. No obligation, no expectation that I follow, just a silent ritual, as natural as breath. One afternoon, as we sat together on the porch while Lily drew chalk pictures across the cement, I finally asked him about it. He looked out toward the horizon and spoke slowly. He said he wasn't a religious man, but there were things he wouldn't have survived without faith. He used to believe control was enough. But eventually, he realized there were fears you couldn't shoot your way out of, couldn't buy your way past, couldn't erase with power. Only faith kept him from falling into the very abyss he had once carved for himself. I asked him what he prayed for each morning. Marco turned to me, his gaze steady, unflinching. He said he prayed for me, to find myself again, for Lily, to have a childhood free from the stain of memory, and for himself, that he might have the courage not to ruin something beautiful that fate had, perhaps mistakenly, given him one more chance to hold. Then he said it, so quietly I thought I imagined it. He would pray in my place. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure I believed in God or any higher power at all. But I believed in the way Marco looked at me when he said it, and I understood then that prayer wasn't just about religion. It was about commitment, about wanting good for someone else, even when you yourself are still unfinished. A few weeks later, I stepped into the chapel alone, not to pray, not yet, just to sit. I brought a notebook with me, thinking I might write something, anything, but instead I simply sat there in silence, listening to the wind slipping through the cracks in the door, the creak of old wood, and the slow chill seeping into my skin. I found myself remembering all the times I had asked if anyone was truly listening, if justice was real, if there was any place in this world for those of us who weren't perfect but still tried, every day, to be good. And when I looked up at the figure of Christ above the altar, I didn't feel judged. I only felt seen, understood. Marco never asked me if I prayed, but every morning, without fail, before leaving the chapel, he paused at the door, lifted his gaze to the canopy of trees in the east. Once, I stood at a distance, following his line of sight, and saw the sun rising, thin but resolute, piercing through the heavy fog like it had done 1,000 mornings before. And I thought, maybe that's what Marco believed in, that no matter how heavy the past, no matter how long the night, the light would always return. And as long as there was someone, somewhere, praying for you with their whole heart, the darkness wouldn't win forever. That morning, I woke with a different kind of feeling. Not pain, not something sharp, just a quiet exhaustion clinging to every step I took, a wave of nausea that passed over me as I stirred my coffee, and a stillness in my mind that didn't feel entirely my own. Marco had already gone out, as he usually did, and Lily was still sleeping, her hair messy on the pillow, her breath steady and soft. I leaned against the kitchen counter, one hand gripping the back of a chair to keep my balance. This feeling wasn't unfamiliar, but this time it carried something deeper, almost instinctual. I opened a drawer and reached for a small box tucked into the far corner, where I had kept a few old things, including a pregnancy test still sealed in its wrapper. I wasn't sure why I had held on to it all these years. Maybe part memory, maybe part fear. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up. 15 minutes later, I sat in the bathroom, staring at the unmistakable result. There was no doubt. I was pregnant. A life was growing inside me. The first feeling wasn't joy. It was a wave of disbelief, almost dizzying. Not because I wasn't ready, but because my heart had never truly expected to feel this kind of miracle again. I thought of Lily, of Marco, of the tired years behind me. And then the tears came, quietly, without resistance. Not out of fear, but because, for the first time, I knew I was being held. I wasn't bracing myself alone against the world anymore. Marco came home, that afternoon, carrying a bouquet of white tulips and a box of pastries, the kind with cream cheese filling that, according to him, Lily had insisted he buy because that's Mommy's favorite. I met him in the kitchen, my heart an unsettled storm, though my eyes could no longer hide what was inside. He set the flowers gently on the table, then turned to me, and as if something inside him had already sensed the shift, he stepped closer and asked, his voice softer than usual, "Is something wrong, Claire?" I didn't answer right away. I simply placed the test in his hand. He looked down, and for a moment that stretched longer than any silence I had ever known, he said nothing. Then he lifted his gaze, and the composure he always wore slipped away. Marco cried, not the loud kind of crying. These were quiet tears, falling slowly onto my hands as he pulled me into his arms. He held me tightly, his body trembling just enough for me to feel it. His voice broke as he spoke. He never thought he would have this. A family. Another chance. Something so clean, so undeserved, it almost frightened him. I whispered against his chest, "You don't have to make up for anything. You just have to be here, like this." And that's exactly what he did. He stood still, holding on to me, as though letting go would cause the whole world to come undone. That night, we didn't play music. We didn't talk much. We just sat together in the kitchen, the soft golden light wrapping around his face, around my hand resting gently on my belly. Lily sat nearby, drawing at the table, unaware of the change, though her eyes kept drifting toward me again and again, as if sensing something had quietly shifted. When I told her the next day, she was silent for a moment, and then she jumped up with joy. "I'm going to be a big sister. Mommy, I'm going to be a big sister." I laughed through tears, pulling her close, feeling her small heartbeat against mine. Pregnancy was no longer unfamiliar, to me, but this time, it carried a different meaning. Not redemption, not a way to fill the emptiness, but a continuation of a journey already mended. This child would not grow up in fear. It would know laughter, dinner tables filled with warmth, mornings where both parents stood by the door to send it off to school, and weekends soaked in love. Marco would teach it to believe in goodness. I would teach it how to rise after falling. And Lily, with her purest child heart, would be the quiet teacher of resilience and forgiveness. In this kitchen, once filled with restless nights, silent tears, and long exhales of uncertainty, now echoed laughter, the clink of spoons against bowls, the sounds of a new life quietly beginning. And in that moment, I knew that nothing from the past could stop us from moving forward. Because now, every part of me was leaning into what lies ahead, with a heart beating a second rhythm beneath my own, and a faith no longer shadowed by fear. On the final afternoon before spring quietly stepped aside for the golden warmth of early summer, I took Lily and Marco back to the Willilamett Bridge, that old bridge where everything had once begun. The place I thought would mark the end. None of us spoke as we walked toward the cold metal railing, the river breeze brushing through our hair, carrying the scent of water and passing time. I stood still, letting my hand rest lightly on the worn iron, memory rising like mist. I remembered the moment the car slipped from the road and dropped into that blank space where everything seemed to vanish. A part of my heart had died there, but it was also there, on that same edge, that a hand reached out. A gaze met mine and gave me a chance I hadn't dared to believe I deserved. Marco didn't just pull me back from the brink, he brought me back to myself. And today, standing here with my daughter, with the child growing within me, and with the man who had walked beside me through it all, I realized life is not only about surviving what breaks us, it is about choosing love again, despite the scars, despite the memories. The evening light tilted through the trees in the distance, laying soft golden streaks across the river. I turned to Marco, then to Lily, who was skipping nearby, light and laughing. My heart felt as if it had taken its first true breath after a long, storm-worn silence. None of us is perfect. We all carry a past, a fear, a wound. But it's from those very places that we learn how to hold on to the good. I used to believe strength was all that mattered. Now I know real strength is opening your heart again. It is believing that the hand reaching toward you is real. It is letting yourself be loved, without fear. This new life of mine wasn't built on grand things. It was made of quiet moments. A dinner table filled with laughter, a night's sleep without waking from nightmares, a morning hug, a whispered prayer for gentler days to come. If you're watching this video and you've known loss, if you've ever believed there was no hope left for a better tomorrow, please remember this. The light may not come all at once, but it is always waiting at the far end of the bridge. Don't let go. Don't close yourself off. Every one of us deserves a new beginning. And maybe, just maybe, like me, you'll find a hand reaching for yours at the very moment you thought it was too late. Thank you for listening to this story today. If it touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone, or brought back a piece of your own journey, I would love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me who this made you think of, or how it speaks to your life. Your heartfelt words are what help dear single moms share more stories of healing every single day. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who might need this message. Dear Single Mom will continue to bring you stories that are tender, powerful, and full of hope for everyone who's ever fallen and still dares to rise again for themselves and those they love. Thank you for being here. Wishing you strength, joy, and peace in every day you live. Until next time.